class. My name is Saxon. We're going to get started in just a moment here with our intermediate camera class on October the 12th, second Thursday of the month. So give it another minute or so and then we'll get started. Let me close the door. I've got a couple people in for in-person camera class, and as always, anybody online, if you have any questions, feel free to chat or ask any questions. Hi there, welcome in.
Hi.
You just made it.
I'm not here for the intermediate. I was supposed to come earlier, but I couldn't get here.
Oh, good. Have a seat, and then we can get started. I'm just about to start the class.
No, I mean, I'm a beginner. I'm
Okay.
intro.
I understand.
Is there a salesman that's over the camera? Can he explain?
Yeah,
the
anybody
basics?
downstairs should be able to talk to you about it. Absolutely.
How to turn it
Yeah.
on?
Yeah, of
Okay.
course.
All right, thanks.
Of course. Make it a little bit bigger. Alright, so intermediate camera knowledge. So I start with the same kind of question I did the last class too. We originally talked about why do we advance past our phone, and it's to get more versatility, more features, more of a personalized experience, just better quality images. But now why do we go more advanced with our point and shoot DSLR or mirrorless? And that's to learn the full manual control over taking photos. If we think back about 20, 30-ish years ago, when film was the only way we took photos, there was really no automatic setting, and if you didn't understand how film worked when it was exposed to light or just kind of the intricacies of taking a photo, you couldn't take the picture at all. Nowadays, with the mirrorless and the DSLR technology, and even just our phones, point and shoots, it really makes taking photos not only easy, but a very almost simple task that a toddler can perform. So now we want to get more advanced from that. We want to be able to not only just shoot on automatic, but understand why our camera is doing what it's doing and maybe have more control over that ourselves. So the first thing I like to show is what I consider to be a snapshot versus a photograph. When we look at a snapshot, it's meant to be a quick image. We're not really studying how the light is reflecting off surfaces, how intense the light is. We're not looking at composition and how we're framing the image. We're just looking to take a cool, maybe a quick photo. If I were to tell my friends to meet me here at the store at Apt Electronics, I might tell them, come by the escalator where you can see the Chicago skyline as it rises up. However, though, if I was visiting for the first time and I wanted to take something a little bit more artistic, maybe I would take the time to make sure that my levels are balanced and that I'm taking a nice composition that's even on both sides, or more symmetrical, if you will. I'll lower my exposure compensation to let the purples and the bright colors of that blue sky that are coming through show a little bit better. Playing with the reflection, I might play with aperture, give myself a nice wide open, or in this case, because I'm seeing everything, I'd probably go like an f/22 or f/14 for the photo. And then as far as the lighting is concerned, we can see that it's more of this cone or yellow lighting that's coming from the walls. So I might play with my ISO level so that it picks up more information on that. Now, those all together, and maybe that's all new terminology, but that's what's going to give us something that looks like a photograph or something that's been well thought out versus something we're taking a quick photo of just to get its picture taken. So it's the difference between setting everything up and understanding the environment that we're in and how it relates to camera terminology, and then translating that into a photograph. That's the kind of stuff that we're looking at today. So the first step, and step one in almost everything that I tell people, is learn your camera. Again, there are hundreds of different models out there. This list has only expanded since I first started teaching this class. There are even older models. There's even models that are going to be coming out in the next couple months or so that we'll see. There's always going to be new cameras on the market. So the first step to everything is to learn what model you have and just understand it like the back of your hand. Understand it well enough that you can have a conversation on your camera. The next thing I like to talk about too, as we get into more of these customizable or fully manual controls, editing software is important too. That's something that is normally talked about in the advanced camera class. I won't be here next week, unfortunately, but Aaron, who's been taking the classes with me now and has been kind of learning under my wing, he'll be controlling that. So he'll go over more of this stuff for you next week. But again, this is just kind of a light look at for what you can do as far as editing your photos and different software that's available. Now the mode dial is going to be the main way that we're able to control our photos. Now when we're looking at the mode dial, the best way I can describe this is it's like the gear shift on your car. When you're switching from park to your drive, or you're switching to neutral, you're using your shifter to do all of that. On the camera, it's going to be very similar. So we talked all last week about being an automatic and understanding either using the green little auto symbol, the green square, the AI, or the auto as it's written out on some of these dials. And that's great to use, but that only is the beginning for what we're trying to use. So automatic is the beginning step. Next steps to learn are going to be program auto, where it stays automatic, and I think, no. Program auto, which stays automatic but gives you things and controls like metering or exposure compensation, or even your focusing brackets, and if you want more of a wide or a close angle focus, maybe what your color is while you're shooting as well. You can set filters on there. Aperture priority gives you just control over the aperture setting of the camera, and we're going to break down what exactly aperture is next. Shutter priority is going to be the same thing, but relating to the speed at which the shutters are opening and closing on your camera. And then the full manual control, how you're able to take all of those different settings and control them all together under one setting, and that would be the full manual. We're going to talk about those three. So before we get any further, the most important thing to remember right now is the exposure triangle. This is going to be the bread and butter of any photographer's kind of beginning charts or cheat sheets or just understanding of the camera. There's three main things that we have to consider when we're using a camera, especially on just a regular photo basis. That's our aperture, our shutter, and our ISO or ISO as people will call it, and that's how I'll refer to it as well too. So starting with our aperture control. Aperture is going to be your depth of field control. The easiest way I can describe this is it's the relationship between your foreground and your background that you're creating. Now, almost all of your lenses that you'll see will most likely go up to the number of f/22. That's going to be the smallest that you're able to make the pinhole, but in a sense, that is going to be the most information that you're able to capture between the foreground and the background. The way to look at this these circles as they're next to the numbers is to think about your eyeball. Think about how your eye has this little black dot in the center, and how that little black dot gets bigger and smaller. The reason our iris changes colors or changes size like that or a pupil I should say, is because as we're exposed to sunlight, our eye naturally will shrink to let in less light because we're saturated within light. We don't need a lot to see. When we're indoors or when we are maybe in a very dark setting, our iris will get very big. It's going to become almost as wide as our physical eye itself. That's letting in the most amount of light because where we're at doesn't allow for a lot of light. In the camera world, what this is doing is the smaller the circle, the more focused on the entire subject before us it is, and the wider the circle, the more or the less of the background that we see and the more of the focusing subject matter that we see.
So the blurring of the background would be best at 1.4?
1.4 the lowest that you can go. Some of your lenses won't go down to 1.4. We talk a little bit more about that at the end too. But when you're buying a lens, prime lenses for the most part are going to be the ones that give you anywhere from a 1.4, 1.2, and I've seen some even higher end lenses go all the way down to 1. Now, when you're looking at more of a telephoto lens, the lowest you can really go is going to be a 2.8. I've sometimes seen a 2 as the lowest, but those are also pretty high-end lenses. Now, for most kit lenses that you're buying with a camera, the lowest you're going to get is a 5.6 or a 4, and that typically will then also change. So they call that a variable maximum aperture, where you'll have something that'll go from a 5.6 to a 6.3. What that means is that, let's say that you have an 18 to 55 millimeter lens. If you're starting at 18, it'll start at that 5.6, but as you move towards that 55, it's going to jump up to 6.3. It's not going to be automatic, but it's going to slowly start to increase. And that just means that the lens that you have has a maximum aperture of either 5.6 to 6.3, depending on your millimeter zoom. When you're looking at this chart, this would be, let's say if you have a prime lens, you've got a 50 1.4 millimeter lens, and this is kind of what you'd be looking at as far as what the blur between your foreground and background goes. So what I tell people, if you've got the family and you're in front of the pyramids and you want to take a beautiful picture, you're probably going to want the pyramids in the background to show that you were there. Using something like an f/22 or f/16, f/11 starts to blur things out, so depending on what your artistic look or eye is, you can maybe go that route. But you probably want to stick to those higher numbers so you get both the background and the foreground. But let's say that you're in front of a really ugly tree in the middle of a forest preserve, and you really just care about getting a nice picture of the kids in front of there, or the family members, or the wife. Going down to a 1.4 or to a 2 to blur that background out wouldn't be a bad idea. It'll hide out that excess space or the negative space that we don't want, and it'll focus in on our main subject matter, which could be yourself, could be somebody else. It's kind of all dependent on what you're trying to get out of there. But aperture is going to have that relationship between our depth and field, or our foreground to background. And I've got some examples to back that up. So for example, I have these two animal pictures. I've got my dog nose on the right side of the screen, and then I've got my squirrel on the left, or depending on where you're viewing, you might see the squirrel on the right and the dog on the left. But regardless, the dog picture is definitely going to have a nice blurred out background, but we can still make out that that's a dog behind the dog's nose. So if I were to take a stab at what that number would be, I probably would say that that's closer to an f/4, maybe an f/5.6, where we can still see the background. We can make out that that's another pyramids, but we don't necessarily know what pyramids they are, maybe the color of the pyramids, so on and so forth. So I'd probably say the same thing, about a 5.6 or an f/4 for our dog's nose on the left side there. Our right first nose is in full clarity. We can make out that it's a dog's nose. We see the eye, we see some shadows. In our background, we can see a pink collar, so we can maybe make a guess that it's a female dog or a lady dog. But other than that, we can't make out where the dog's eye contact is at. It could be staring at the camera, could be staring at an owner to the left, who knows. Now when we look at our squirrel on the other hand, we have a very blurred out background. And given the color of the background, we probably can make out that it's trees or foliage or some form of forest environment where a squirrel would be located. But we can't really make out any finer details. But we can tell that it's on a piece of wood of some sort, and we can see our squirrel in full clarity eating something, a nut or a pecan or something. So on the squirrel side, that I would probably put closer to an f/1.4 or an f/2. Because we can't necessarily make out the background of the squirrel. Our main subject or focus is going to be the squirrel that's right in front of us. Now the other reason we might want to use something like aperture priority, or we might care about aperture, is for what we call bokeh effect. Now bokeh is really cool because it's the way that the camera can take the background, blur it out so much that we're left with what we call bokeh dots. Not to be confused with polka dots. But bokeh is a really nice way of being able to blur out the background, and when you have this really nice lighting or intensity of light, you'll start to see it throughout the whole image, kind of as these little balls of light. Hey, welcome in. So with the bokeh effect, you're not missing much if you're not able to get it. But typically what I tell people is if you have a lens that's between a 1.4, 1.2, and sometimes even a 1.6 depending, you should be able to get the bokeh effect. Anything higher than that, the camera most likely won't be able to do that. But for example, behind this little Lego minifigure is actually a bunch of Christmas lights. But because that we're blurring out our background so intensely and we're only staring at our main subject, you can't make out that those are Christmas lights. They just look like extra lights in the background. As far as what you've missed, not too much. We really just talked about our aperture priority. We're getting into the exposure triangle of things. Aperture, as I was explaining to everybody, is your relationship between your foreground and your background. Your biggest number is going to allow you to see the most scene between the background and the foreground, and your smallest number is going to change that up so that you're really only focused on the subject, not the background itself. So depending on what you're trying to get, the way I describe it, if you and the family are on vacation and you've got a historic monument behind you, you really want to get a good photo, use the f/22 or f/16 so you get both the background and the foreground. If you want to just take a nice clean headshot of somebody, you don't want any background, you don't want anything else on there, then the f/1.4, f/2, f/2.8, depending on what lens you have, would be the best way for you to get rid of the negative space and just focus on subject.
What about 1.8?
1.8 is fine too. Yeah, that's in that same category. The lower the number, the more blur on the background you're getting, and the more focus on the subject that you're getting.
Under aperture, do you get automatic ISO?
Yes, if you're using the aperture priority, as long as you have your camera set to that. Now, if you click on the ISO and you take a look, you should be able to see if your camera's set to automatic ISO on there.
You know what, I mean, it's been set that way, so
Yeah.
it doesn't change that.
Yeah,
So
so
you
it'll
don't
just
have to worry about
yeah.
that at all.
You don't have to worry about that unless you switch it. On all of these priority modes, you technically can switch between automatic ISO and set ISO, and you should be able to in automatic ISO too switch it between multiple numbers. I know on my Sony I can do it, and I'm almost positive Nikon and Canon both allow it. But if you only want your ISO to work from 100 to 3200, you could set that instead of the 100,000 that your camera is able to get up to. Most people, they'll leave it alone, but there might be certain situations where if you're using lighting or strobes or a studio setup, you might not want your ISO to go that high if you don't need it to.
So would you be shooting inside without a flash?
I would.
Aperture priority still?
No. Well, yes, because really for me personally, I only use shutter priority when I'm doing things with action or sports. So if I go to a soccer game and I bring my camera with me, I'm going to put it on the shutter priority because I'm not necessarily worried about my depth of field on that one. I'm mainly focused on what the speed of
Because
my
I know
camera
when I've been shooting with this inside, there's sort of a yellowish tint to the pictures.
That could be just the lighting on the
In the
room
house?
itself.
In the
Yeah,
house.
that could be the lighting itself on there.
balance maybe.
White balance could be off on there too. That's all.
I've got it under automatic white
Yeah,
balance.
then you should be fine there. So it's probably the lighting in the room then.
But it's boosting the ISO up. Right?
Yes,
It
it should be. It
Should
should be
be
at least.
anyway.
Yeah, if you hit the playback button on the image and then look to see what the numbers that it shows, it should show you a higher ISO depending on its lighting. Like for this room, for example, when I brought my camera into here, my ISO will spike usually not as far as 3200, but not far off of
Really
3200.
that high, huh?
Yeah, just because the can lighting and the recessed lighting on here isn't necessarily the best, and so the camera kind of mooches off the drop lights that are coming onto the table or the lights that are coming under this where it sees the intense glare. I think that's what the camera's picking up on.
So would you use your flash in here?
Yeah, I would. I mean, depending on what I'm taking a photo of, maybe I like the lighting on here. Maybe I want that because it adds more to the mood. But if I'm doing something more of like the photography for food and whatnot, if I'm getting that uneven lighting, that's where maybe I'd set 2 standalone lights up, shine onto my object, where then now you have your key light, your background light, and your fill light kind of adding all into what the image is. I can always make the image darker later on in an editor, but I can't really make it lighter without making things look too standoffish with the contrast and everything
Yeah,
else.
that does.
Yeah. You can always make a photo darker. It's hard to make a photo lighter. And that's what I usually tell people. So why do we use aperture priority mode? And I think this picture is really nice to kind of illustrate that. If you've got a beautiful background and you really want to try to capture the entire image, it might be really tough to set your camera on automatic and focus in on something, especially if you have maybe a point or like a singular square set for your focusing area and you're not using a wide format. In this case too, even if you're focusing and you have a wide focus parameter set, all your camera might need to do is focus on one of these small little rocks and it can blur the rest of the background out. So rather than allowing for your camera to have that much control over you and what you're taking a picture of, use the aperture priority. It gives you the chance to make sure that your relationship between foreground and background is what you want. And in this case, you have the nice lady standing on the mountainside there overlooking the cliffs. She probably wants a picture with the sunset, the water, and everything in the background, and not just a picture of herself with everything blurred out.
So you'd be like F-22 or this?
Yeah, I would absolutely say that. F-22, F-16. At the very end, I've got like 7 or 8 photos that will go through, and I'll call out what I'm seeing on there to kind of give you an idea of what I see when I'm looking at a photo. And then to review one more time. So we got a little garbage can in the background there of this forest preserve area. We've got a body of water, some foliage, and then some more trees in the background, some nice green grass, and probably what's a parking lot right behind the trash can. And our main focus is this branch of dead wood right in front. As we lower the F number and start going more and more down, we start to lose everything in the background, and our main focus becomes this piece of dead wood on the side there. So if you were trying, or you as a photographer went out and you were like, I can't get this image from anywhere else, this is the perfect angle I need to be at, but I don't like that garbage can in the background. Nowadays, with editors, and especially with Adobe's Photoshop's AI generative technology, you could just circle the garbage can and say no more, and it'll take it away for you. But if we're not using Adobe and we're not using any editor softwares for our photos, and we want to do it all naturally with the power of our camera, we would blur that background out. When we get to f2, we can still make out that there's some green behind it. We can see a little dark color where the garbage can is, but we also see a little dark color over there, so we probably would think that it translates to maybe being a road or a pathway, and all our main focus is this branch. So again, when all else fails, if you yourself don't want to edit your photos and you're trying to get things just to look as clean as possible, playing with that f-stop number gives you a chance to not only blur the background out, but in a sense make things go away that we don't want there. In the case of the garbage can where it's affecting our image and it could possibly make it not look the prettiest, we can technically erase it without having to do any crazy editing softwares.
I mean, if you're in a restaurant, you know, and you try to take a picture of your friend sitting at the table, how do you beat everyone behind in front?
Yeah.
Will that knock it out?
It'll help. I mean, if you're just taking a picture of your two friends that are sitting there and you turn your f-stop down to 2.8 or 1.4, anything behind it should basically go away. I have an image that I took of my friends. He was sitting in a car and I took a picture of him and I used the lower f-stop on there, and it was able to blur out the rest of the back seating in the car, the glare from the window that was coming through, and I basically just had him holding onto his steering wheel as I shot down from where he was at. So yeah, you technically can blur stuff like that
It's
out.
hard to get rid of people behind.
It is.
I've done it on editing and it
Yeah.
doesn't really work. So.
Nowadays with the new Photoshop stuff, and I don't like to use that as like a kind of one-all trick, but Photoshop just came out with that generative AI technology where you literally can circle things on the photo that you don't like and say fill in with just restaurant or take away the car. The example that I saw online was someone took a beautiful picture of a car that was or a bicyclist on a street in Italy, and there was a car that was basically doing a U-turn right behind them. They were able to circle the car and say remove vehicle, and it took the car away and generatively made what the background of that would look like, and it looks
Because I subscribe to that. Do I have that?
yeah, you should if you're subscribed
I
to
used to
Photoshop.
do it by circling it and hit delete.
No, yeah, you don't have to do that anymore. No.
That's gone.
No, you can still do that, and you can still go through and match and do all that, but now you can just circle it and then type into this generative AI what you want it to be.
And even if you have like Lightroom or something like
Yeah.
that, they also have new like AI tools and stuff you can use in that.
So
as
how do
well.
I mean? So when you do that, you circle it. How do you tell it to get rid of it?
There's a little box that'll then pop up
That
that
pops
says,
up.
says what do you want?
What do you want?
Yeah.
You want zero, nothing there?
Well, you can, but at least again, there's so many videos on how to do it. I personally haven't done it myself, but there's a new tool that pops up, and then you circle it, and then you can say get rid of car, get rid of vehicle.
And just with the circle tool?
yeah,
That's it?
yeah. And it already
That's
prompts it.
in Lightroom also?
Yeah.
And even if you had like your aperture at like an f16 or something like that, and you go in the Lightroom, like one of the tools they have now as well allows you to blur the background a little bit more. So if you did have people in the background, you can always edit.
And they do that in Adobe Photoshop?
I don't know if they do it in Photoshop, but in
Lightroom.
Lightroom,
Because I
they,
don't use Lightroom, I use Photoshop.
yeah, I was gonna say I'm not sure if they have it in Photoshop, but I know they have it in Lightroom for sure. So.
I never learned how to use Lightroom. Right?
But either way, there's options to get rid of it. So when you're looking at something like using your aperture priority setting, that's one way of helping you blur the background. If not, there's always ways in post-production when you can do that too. So shutter speed, that's the next thing that we talk about on this guy. Shutter speed is the speed at which your shutter is closing and opening over the image sensor. So the best way to think about that is that the slower or the higher the number is, slower the number. Let's start with this. Everything that shows a 1 is referring to a second. So if you're shooting at 1 500ths of a second, which is what this guy is, that means you're shooting 500 times faster than what the regular shutter speed, or 1 500ths of that second, would be as a shutter speed. So that's a pretty quick image. When you get down to something like half a second, that's where you're getting a very slow shutter speed. And so what the little diagram here is showing is that if you were taking a picture of someone running in the Chicago Marathon, let's say, you'd probably want to shoot with something at a higher speed in order to make sure you catch them with no blurriness, with no motion. faster an object is going, the faster your shutter speed should be going. The slower the object is going, the slower your shutter speed can be. Shutter speed, as you're playing with it, will also affect your aperture and your ISO. So when you're first getting into this, one of the things I always recommend is using that shutter priority mode is really nice because it'll adjust everything else on your camera. You're only controlling the speed at which your shutter is going. And as you start to change those dials and those knobs, pay attention to what your aperture and your ISO will do, because it'll either open or I would say make the aperture more wide or make it smaller. It could also bring your ISO up or bring it down depending on the speed at which your shutter is going. Same thing for aperture. Depending on the aperture priority that you're using, the shutter or the ISO can be impacted by this. And it's nice to learn that way through your priority modes, because then that way, instead of just learning it all on full manual where you're constantly changing and switching stuff, this kind of makes it more simplified for you, where it's only one thing that's changing, your camera is then adjusting everything else.
So when you shoot with flash, 1/60th was always the number I remember.
Yeah.
To shoot. So when you shoot flash, did you shoot in with shutter?
You can,
Shutter
yeah, it would
priority?
be priority. It would be better to shoot with the shutter priority, because typically your flash is working based on the speed at which your camera is opening and closing. On most intro level flashes, it has an automatic setting on there, so you don't have to really fiddle with it too much. But when you get to more of the complex ones that get 60-70 range for their light spectrum, that's where then it becomes more of you're setting your camera to 1 1/100th of a second. So then you need to make sure that you set your flash to 1 1/100th of a second. So it depends on which flash and what you're going for. So some examples that I have. So when we talk about freezing action or more high-end or high-action sports, and I think of like surfing, I think of track and field. If you're doing a 100-meter dash, I think of basketball. Maybe not necessarily the whole game, but especially when they're doing a fast break or they're trying to get down the court with speed, you don't want to use something that's only 1 500th of a second. You definitely want to get closer to 1 1,000th of a second or faster. When we look at something like this, we can see our surfer is in full complexion here. We don't really have a lot of blurriness or movement on the surfer. Everything from his feet to the board to him looks planted, firm, and still. But when we look at the water, we can see the amount of movement on the water and how that's just kind of being more violent. That's because there really is no way of capturing that at a faster pace. But also, that's not necessarily the main point of this photo. Main point is going to be our surfer. So we want to make sure that we get them in perfect clarity. A little bit of blurriness around the surfer acquaints to more motion. And on my next photo, giving a sense of motion isn't necessarily the most terrible thing, especially when the main subject or the main priority of our shot is made. So for example, when we look at this hummingbird, hummingbirds' wings move at about 100 flutters a second. It's a crazy number. They can they flutter at such high speed that they almost look like they're levitating from space to space. And that's why when you watch a hummingbird, they bounce. They're really incredible birds, but they're one of the hardest to capture in a photograph. When we look at this one, we can see that the motion of the bird is perfect, at least on the body. We get these nice greens, yellows, and browns where the furs where the feathers are really coming through, the red of the beak, and if you look closely, you can even see a little fly in the bird's beak. So it's very still. But where we see motion, similar to where we're seeing motion with our surfer, where the water has blur and has kind of this movement or effect to it, the wings of the hummingbird have the same thing. And that's just given that the hummingbird's wings are moving at such a fast speed that we're not necessarily able to slow those down enough to make them still. Does that make it a bad photo? Not necessarily, but it's all dependent on what we're looking to get out of this. Another thing that shutter priority can do, that full manual can also do, is create mood with long exposures. Now, long exposures are nice because what you're doing is you're setting the camera to stay completely open, not close its shutters, for maybe about 10 or 15 seconds, maybe even less, 5 seconds as well too. What that's doing is it's taking all the information, the light, and everything else that the camera can see, and it's oversaturating our image. So it's giving us more contrast, better highlights, brighter colors, colors, maybe even more movement on there depending. The biggest killer to long exposures is movement. If your camera wiggles even a little bit, you're going to get a bad photo. You need to make sure you're using a tripod or you have this on a very sturdy surface. So when I show this to people, I either say this photo was done with a tripod, or because of how these ledges on the rocks are all set up, maybe they set it on a set of rocks and then took the photo too. And the reason we can tell it's long exposure is if you look closely, you can see the variation of color within the greens. There's a big spectrum of colors between some dead foliage, the really dark foliage behind everything, the part that's hitting direct sunlight, part that's getting hit with shade, even some of the different moss and the mold that's growing on the wall there. The rocks have complex colors, highlights, and dark points, and the water too. The water naturally has this really nice movement to it, but we can see that there's a lot of parts that are very detailed and filled in because the water's rushing over a small period of time, and the camera is staying open in order to capture all of that. So long exposures are a great way of capturing mood or creating more saturation or color within the image. It's the complete opposite of using something like a 1 in 1,000th or 1 in 2,000th of a second. Here you're using what would be called the bulb setting, that B, and I know we talked about that in the last class. B is going to be where you're letting your camera shutter speed stay open for as long as you want. You are then clicking the button afterwards to stop it. Another example of long exposure on this one. So you have what looks to be a train going in the background. You've got your gentleman standing in front of the train platform. You've got his bike. The bike, the wall, him, the floor there, it all looks perfect. It's all in perfect stillness, good coloration on the blue, on his red. You see everything. But when you look at the train itself, it's speeding by, and all you get are the lines or the colors as they whisk by. But as you look through the sides of the train, as they would cut through, there'd be gaps. It can actually start to read what's behind the train, because there's little areas where it's exposing itself to the camera, and as it's exposing over a period of time, the camera's able to read all of that. So it can read the building right behind, some of the trees in the distance as well too. That's all happening because you have a long exposure that's running, and then not only is it capturing what it sees, but as that continues to move, it's going to capture behind the train where those gaps are appearing.
How long of exposure would something like that be?
That could be anywhere between, I'd say, 5 to 10 seconds. So again, and I've seen people go even further than that. My only maybe hesitation with allowing for a longer exposure than about 10 seconds is you can get to what's called image burn on your sensor after a while, and you're basically letting the sensor naturally over time get a little worn out by being open for so long. It's the same reason why when you're changing the lens on your camera, you should always hold your camera upside down, not to let any dust or any other debris fall in there, but also to keep it sensitive from the light and everything else. So why use shutter priority? This was a picture a customer emailed me a long time ago. This is why. If you're out and about and you're taking pictures of, in this case, an ultimate frisbee game, and you're not quite sure why the camera's not able to pick up on movement like that, it's not, it most likely isn't you if you're using automatic. It's just the fact that you don't know how to use the shutter priority or maybe more manual control properly. The shutter priority really gives you good control of creating the speed at which that the camera is opening and closing. So when you have somebody running like this to get loose for a frisbee, or because they're playing football, or maybe they're running up the basketball court, or you got, the lion running through that, African safari, using shutter priority will help you speed the shutter up so that hopefully you can slow the image itself down.
So if you were taking a photo of, say you're at a concert and they're dancing,
Mm-hmm.
what would your shutter?
I probably would go a little slower. It depends on how fast they're dancing. I mean, when I think about a 1 in 1,000th shutter speed, I think of like the surfer who's getting whipped around by the waves. It's a fast movement. I think I have another image of a motorcycle going across a dome. That's moving really fast. If I'm using somebody who's dancing, depending on how fast their legs or their body is moving, I probably would start at 1/500th, and then I would just go up from there.
Oh.
But again, it's going to all be touch and feel. It's not going to be, because you have to take into effect the lighting of the area, depth of field that you see with that, and that's where using the priority modes are great, because the camera will readjust as it sees other things. But then that's when full manual gets tricky, because then you have to play the both. You have to say, okay, well, if I can see them and I don't care about the background, let's go f22. That makes the pinhole really small, so I'm already not allowing a lot of light in. Now I've got to readjust my shutter speed. How do I maximize getting this image without necessarily changing my shutter or changing my depth of field? And that's where you're playing with stuff. And then as you take that photo, it might come out too dark, so now you're reopening up your aperture, making it maybe like an f16 or an f8, taking the shutter speed from 1/500th to 1/750th of a second. It's all touch and feel.
Because I notice like sometimes in these places it's darker and like whether they're dancing or they're playing the drums. And what I hate, I get a good picture, but then you look at their hands
And they're blurry.
yes.
That also could just become from the lighting. I mean, you have a Sony, so you're pretty good for low light situations, I would say. But that also could be the lighting of the situation. There's a lot of times where I brought my camera to concerts and it's been dark, and I'll get okay images in the beginning depending on their strobes or what other lights they have. But as soon as they get to a point where there's not a lot of light going, it doesn't matter how fast or how open I am or how slow, I'm still going to get blurry movement, everything else, because the camera doesn't necessarily have enough to grasp onto. There's that old trick of, and I remember doing it in grammar school and when I was younger, you take the box, you poke a hole through it, you put a little mirror on the inside, and as long as you have light going through, you basically made your own makeshift camera, where you stick your head up to it and the pinhole is letting in light that's bouncing off a mirror, and then you're able to see everything that's on there. The only reason any of that works is because you have light. That's the main source. So a lot of the times in these more enclosed concert, dance hall, or just kind of, more centers, I would say, with a stage with low lit or dim lighting, it's hard to pick up on that. So it could be a mix of them.
And you can't use your flash.
Exactly. That's where they get you on a lot of that stuff. But it's not uncommon. I would try playing with the shutter speed. I'd start at 1/500th of a second. Make sure that your aperture is set appropriately if you're using full manual. If you're just using shutter priority, just basically keep turning the shutter up on the speed until it gets where you want it to be. That was the image that I was thinking of. So yeah, if I were using something like this, given how fast that dirt bike is going, and given the fact that this guy's lucky to be in the air for more than maybe 2 to 3 seconds at most, I definitely want a faster shutter speed in order to capture this. Now, ISO. ISO, the best way I could describe this is that if you were someone who shot in film or you understand film, when you're buying a roll of film, on the film it's going to give you a number, and that could be Kodak 100, Kodak 800, Ilford 400. There's multitudes of different brands. Those are the two that popped in my head right now. But that ISO number, or that number that's written on the film, is the film's exposure number. That's what its light rating is going to be when you're shooting outside. The lower the light, the less light, or the more light that you'll need in order to get a better saturation of color. And the higher the number is, the more light that it's allowing in, so the less light that's necessarily needed.
Wait, can you say that again?
Sorry. So the lower the number, typically, the darker the whole image is. So you'll need more light for a lower number.
So like if you're outside, you would want a lower number.
Yeah, I would say so, because you've got direct sunlight, but it's all dependent again on the environment that you're
Right,
in.
like if you're outside and the sun, I mean, it's daytime.
Yeah, it's a gorgeous day, not overcast, no clouds. 100 would be more than enough, most likely. Maybe even 200. Everybody's different in how they do it. And that's why I usually recommend using auto ISO, and we'll talk about that in a second. But with using ISO, the lower the number, typically the better off for brighter situations that you are, and the higher the number, the better for lower situations that you're at. Now again, when you buy a roll of film, it's going to be 36 images that you're taking, and
You're
they're all
stuck.
going to be,
You're stuck at whatever number it is.
Exactly.
In the old days, I remember those days.
Exactly. And a lot of people still like that feeling or that way of doing things. Now, the cool thing with the digital or mirrorless cameras is that you can change that number at any time, and it always comes down to your discretion of how your camera is reading light given the situation that you're in. So when we look at the images of the pier and the water and everything else, 100 ISO, the image itself is pretty dark, the bridge is dark, where the beach and the water line up, you don't really get a lot of coloration from the sky. 200, we're getting a lot more coloration from the sky, but we're still a little dark underneath the bridge and around the bridge. Once we get to 400 and 800, that sky really becomes more apparent. We're getting more separation between the water and the beach, and that dark parts that were underneath the bridge are starting to lighten up. They're not necessarily any less doomy or gloomy than what we saw in the earlier images, but they do help a little bit.
So you're saying like if you had shot at 100, it would be harder to get an 800 as if you had shot at 800, bringing the dark up to light.
Yes, if you're trying to make that darker image lighter, it might not read the same way and it might start to look a little bit choppy. That could be the contrast, the highlights, that could be a lot. But if you wanted to take that 800 image and make it darker, closer to the 100, you should be able to.
Easier.
Yeah, it'd be easier. Yeah. ISO also equates to noise, and that's an important thing to remember too. So when you're using ISO, it's important that if you're not using automatic ISO, that you take into account that if you have a lot of light or a decent amount of light and you try to raise your ISO up because you want to try to get something maybe more bright, your camera might kind of not do that for you. It might not make things any lighter than it already was. It might start to create what we call noise. And I like to consider that the static that you'd see on your TV when there would be no channel. The more ISO we turn on, the more noise we have. And the way we get more noise is when we turn our ISO up to a point where there's enough light in the room or enough light in the setting area that then it just becomes a little bit too muddled or dark or cloudy. And that's what you're seeing between these two images right here. So 100 ISO with the, not Sears Tower, that would be the, I think the Chrysler building. 100 ISO with our New York skyline, it's going to look a lot more even, natural. Once we turn that ISO up to a higher number though, that's where we're going to start to get that kind of ugly dots or pixelation going around.
Can you fix that in Lightroom?
Yes and no. You can. I've done it a couple times. It can be a little bit tedious, and sometimes the program doesn't pick up that information the way that I'd like it to. So typically in that setting, I would usually recommend, especially if you're having a tough time with that, just use auto ISO. Again, it's maybe not sometimes everyone's favorite, but for the most part, your camera is extremely intelligent when it comes to light. That's my main point that I would make to that. It can really read well if it sees a lot of light or if it doesn't. So if you're trying to get into even the manual controls of your camera, controlling things like aperture and the shutter speed, I think are more than enough, and to allow your camera to do what it does with the light, I think that would be just fine. Even if, let's say, you've got studio lighting or strobe lighting set up on there, most people will get away with auto ISO and they'll never notice a difference between if they switched it to a number and read the light better. I have apps on my phone for reading the light. I sometimes have used them, but typically what I've done in the past just to experiment with my cameras, I've put a little adapter on top of my camera where my phone can live, and then I shoot on the camera and the phone at the same time. What I'll do on the phone is I'll open up my light meter where it'll read the lighting in the surroundings that I'm in, and it'll just scan for light and it'll tell me what it thinks my camera should be set to. I won't set my camera at all. I'll just keep it on auto ISO, and a lot of the times the camera will match up with exactly what my light metering told me to do. So in a lot of cases where people are struggling with how to use ISO, I usually tell them, experiment with something like this where you take the same image 4 or 5 or 6 or 8 times, play with all the lighting, do it in multiple scenarios where you've got overcast, maybe you've got direct sunlight, you've got glare, you've got all these different kind of things that would change how your camera's reading light. And then from there you can kind of educate yourself on how your camera's doing it or what the main readout should be from there. Going back though, you'll start to see the noise as you turn things up. It won't necessarily be as aggressive of like, oh, I don't see any noise until I get to that 3200. You can turn it up to ISO 300, and if that's too much light for your camera to take in, you'll start to see the noise immediately. So it could just be a small movement of the dial in order to get that more drastic of a number. My best recommendation, if that still is confusing you, would be to stick with the auto ISO on there. I know it might seem like you're not using the camera to its full potential, but given how smart the camera is when it comes to light, I think that's the one setting most people can get away with without having to really worry. For one of my cameras that I shoot on, I call it my vacation camera. When I take it with me, I keep it at 800 ISO because it gives me more of the look of film. A lot of the times film was 800 was a good number for your film, just so that way you could get a little bit lower light situations and then not so light situations, or some very bright situations. It was a good versatile film number, but it also exposes itself very easily, so depending on certain things, you gotta be careful with that type of film, with that number. Different story from when you're using digital. So to review again, to go through everything separately, my piggies on the top here, we've got two pigs that are sitting on the corner of a couch. When we look at f16, we can see the back of the wall, we can see the pillows on the couch, and as we get down to that smaller number, we're just focused on the pigs, everything in the background starts to go away. When we come down to shutter speed, at 1/1000th for us and this gentleman hammering a nail onto a wooden board there, we can see that in full motion. It looks good, it's clean, he's coming down hammering. As we start to slow down that shutter speed, not only can we see that our background is progressively getting darker and darker as we're going, but now we're starting to lose either the hammer or the hand and the hammer as it's going through, and we're getting more and more of a blurred image. The part that's not getting blurred though is our board. Because the board is staying exactly in the same spot, that's not going to change color or move or do anything differently. Color, it can change just slightly, I didn't mean to say it like that, but its movement, its placement, how still everything is, the nail, that's all going to still show up because that's not moving. But our fist, our hand, is still moving. The color part will start to change. That's because as we have a faster shutter speed, we're letting more light in, which either means that it could wash out or slightly kind of get rid of some of those deeper colors or saturations. As we start to make that speed slower, we can notice that the background becomes darker because we're now allowing for a little more light to come into the camera. Therefore, we're giving more saturation or more color. The same thing when we have long exposures and we can see more of the greens or more of the cracks on the pavement. We're going to pick all of that up more when our shutter speed is slower because it can absorb more of that color, read more of that information. And then ISO on the bottom. This is in the same setting. We just have kept raising the ISO number up as we went for this penny sitting on a black table. At ISO 100, the penny looks nice, the wood looks nice, you can see the grain, it's dark, there's a shadow coming from the penny, it looks clean. As we go up on that number, we start to notice that the color of the penny starts to get lighter and lighter, our wood color starts to get more gray, and then by the time we get to 2500, we can almost not even make out that scent. It doesn't even look like that anymore. And also we start to really lose that relationship between that color. And that's all because that noise, that grain, the brightness, it's all increasing as we change that number. So exposure compensation, your exposure meter. ISO and exposure are two separate things. ISO is looking at the light in the whole room, it's reading what your environment is, and then it's giving you that kind of result on your camera. It's the sensitivity towards the light. Exposure has to do with the still image itself. So if you've set everything on your ISO, you've gone through, your aperture is where you want it, your shutter is where you want it, but the picture still might not look bright enough or dark enough, that's where we can change our exposure compensation. These are going to be full stops when we see a number, and anywhere in between would be a half stop. Now, as we're looking at this, if we go +1, +2, we're going to get a brighter image. That's typically going to be a little bit more light in certain areas. Color might start to get washed out, especially when we get like to the 2 or a 3 on some of these cameras. But if you go maybe 1/2 step in, or a 1/4 of a step in, that might be enough just to add a little bit more lightness to your photo, or on the vice versa, add a little bit more darkness to your photo. That's all something that you can control when you're using aperture and shutter priority. If you've never seen this before, it might be because you're shooting on automatic, but even program auto, which is still auto for the most part, allows you to change and program this. So it's not necessarily a shortcut or a way to not change your ISO, but it's a great tool if you've already changed your ISO and done everything you can with your lighting. You can now play with the exposure of the entire frame.
Do the cameras, the new automatic cameras, I remember the old ones, you had to physically bring it back to 0.
A lot of the times you still gotta,
It still doesn't, so you have to remember
yes.
to put it back.
Yes. The only reason being is because let's say you're in the same environment and you're shooting the same picture over and over again. It's not naturally just going to go back to zero, because if you're shooting in the same place, the camera stays primed for where you're at. If you want it to then go back, you just got to turn that dial and set it back and remember. Usually though, on the bottom corner of the screen, or if you're looking through the viewfinder, typically you'll see this on the bottom, and they make it pretty clear as day as where this notch is on there. So I always, when I'm shooting, because my Sony, I actually have little plunger buttons, so that way it doesn't move on accident. But one of the biggest complaints on the earlier models was that when you would hold it to your face, if you turned slightly, you would actually turn the exposure meter on the physical camera. So they created a little button that you push in, so that way if you accidentally do rub against it, it won't switch or move or change anything. So as you're shooting, look through, and if you're looking through the viewfinder, or look at that little screen and just look for that exposure meter on the bottom. Make sure it's at 0, or I like to also say home plate, because this kind of uncanny looks like a home plate. Now full manual, I won't really talk too much about that because it's kind of everything that we already just talked about. Full manual is control over both aperture and shutter speed. The best way to talk about that is to remember that when you're switching on your aperture priorities, the camera's dictating everything else for you. It's saying, okay, if you're going to move to this shutter speed, let's make aperture this, let's make ISO this. If you're doing full manual, it's not going to do that for you. It'll change ISO if you've got automatic ISO, but the other two items are something that you'll be changing the entire time. So keep that in mind when you're shooting. Now this, I'll go through a couple images right now and kind of explain what I'm seeing. I'll talk about ISO, shutter, and then also the f-stop that I think that we're seeing on there. So for something like this image, because we have just a basic landscape shot, I don't think that the f-stop is anything less than maybe a 16, just because you're able to see everything in almost perfect clarity. Could be a little bit lower than that, but definitely not a 1.4 or a 2.8. As far as ISO goes, I think the ISO is a little high for what it should be, because I see a little bit of graininess in certain dark areas, especially where the pole is. It's a little bit gray and muted out. On top of that too, the lights on the physical building are very, very bright and intense. So that would lead me to believe that if this required maybe a 200, 300 ISO, maybe they're shooting at something closer to 800, 600, or 900. And as far as shutter speed goes, because we don't have a lot of movement on this photo, because there's also a lot of nice saturation and colors in this, and we also have those bright, overly saturated lights, this could be a long exposure image. Not necessarily 10 seconds long, but this could be as long as maybe half of a second or 2 seconds long, just to get enough where you're seeing the variation between brick colors, where the roof changes colors between that dark green and black, that sort of thing. Even on the kind of boardwalk there, that coloration difference between the posts is a little bit more apparent. Got some cherry blossoms. Now in this case, we can see the background is blurred out slightly, but it's not blurred out enough that we can't make out that it's an image of more cherry blossoms. So this could also be at that 4, 5.6, similar to the dogs, where we can see what's in the background, but we can't really make out the finer details. As far as ISO goes, the parts that are very dark on this image don't have any grain or have little to no grain, I would say. So ISO 100, ISO 200 is probably what I would have used on something like this. And as far as an f-stop goes, or a shutter speed I should say, these branches probably aren't moving very quickly. So, rule of thought, 1/60th of a second is a good shutter speed pace. 1/125th of a second is also a good shutter pace. Those are for pretty standard images, where you're not doing really any crazy movement, or that's just enough time for the camera to read the information and process a good image if you've got the ISO and the aperture set properly.
So like for portraits?
Yeah, I'd say 1/60th of a second would be just fine for that. You can go even slower too if you have a tripod. 1/30th of a second wouldn't be a bad idea. My only fear with that is that if you're not using something for stability, you might get a little shake on there every time that you take a picture. And then I also have a message there. Hello from South Africa. Hello there. Going back into it, so we've got our two firemen. This is very similar to that dog photo we had where one of the dogs was blurred out in the background, but we could see one clearly in the foreground. In this case, though, where the other dog was blurred out to the point where you could really make out that it was another dog, and you could see kind of the direction that its face was going, but not the eyes. In this case, we really lose almost everything on the other fireman's face in the background, but we can definitely make out that they're another fireman because we can see they have another walkie unit similar. They've got a helmet on and a strap that looks almost identical to the gentleman in the foreground, so it'd be safe to assume that it's another fireman. With that type of background, it probably would lean a little bit lower on the number. Instead of a 4.5 or a 5.6, I'd probably say more of a 4, possibly a 3.2, but I wouldn't say any lower than that because, again, we can make out who that's another fireman. We just can't tell the finer details.
And if you couldn't make it out, it would be like a 1.4.
Yeah, I mean, possibly. It could be a 2.8, could be a 4. I mean, it really is dependent on the situation, that depth of field that we have between the two. But if I had to take a guess on there, I would probably say, yeah. And if we really couldn't make them out and it would look like a blob, then probably a 1.4, 1.2.
I love the photos with the bokeh.
They're really fun. That's like, for a lot of people, those are, for me, I think that's what a lot of people try to get into photography with because they like the idea of just being able to focus in on one thing. Shutter speed, unless they're walking, this is probably a slower shutter speed. I'd say 1/60th, 1/125th of a second, nothing too crazy. And as far as ISO goes, the color looks really nice. The darker colors look really nice on the subject matter. So I really don't think it's too high of an ISO. Plus, I can kind of see a shine of a light coming right at the top of their helmet. And a lot of this side is illuminated where a lot of this side is darker. So my imagination would be that light's coming from this direction hitting them, and the side of his face obviously is more lit up. As far as ISO goes, maybe a 400 if the lighting wasn't that good, but probably closer to that 200, maybe a 100 would be a little too dark. You got this ram's head from a museum. So you go to like a place like a field museum, they've got their animals set up on the exhibit where then you can kind of take a picture of them and see what environment they would be in. But this would be in one of those situations where you got a stuffed ram. You can see the detail in the horns is really clean. The detail in the fur is really nice, but our background is pretty significantly blurred out. You can definitely tell that it's a winter environment, or we can see the tree trunks and dead branches on the ground there. So the background is blurred out, but not blurred out enough that we can't tell what it is. So also I probably would go 5.6, 4, maybe the lowest on there. As far as the ISO is concerned, I don't see a lot of grain in these darker areas, which would lead me to believe this is more of a long exposure shot, just given the saturation of color. How long of a long exposure? This could be only half a second, possibly at the most 5. I don't think it would be 5. I probably would say more to that lower end of half of a second, maybe a third of a second as well too, just to be a little slower. And as far as the speed goes on this, again, it's not moving, at least in my experience. I don't think that the stuffed ram would be moving. If it is, it's probably a problem. But I probably would say maybe 1/60th of, oh, we already talked about that for the long exposure. Yeah, no, I think everything on there, ISO, yeah. We got some more movement photos on this one, so now we have definitely more speed on this. In both cases, I definitely would say shutter speed is about 1/1000th of a second. The dogs are in midair, they're jumping. Not only are they in midair, but we can clearly make out all of the features on the dog. It's not hard to see. The teeth are in stillness. Even with the guy who's catching this one on the side there, it's in the mouth. You see the paws are coming down. We can clearly see the paws. We can even see grass stuck in between the physical kind of nubs on their feet there. So we've got movement, and but we're able to slow it down enough where then we can get them in perfectly still images. As far as ISO goes, I don't think anything more than 100 is necessary because you've got clean sunlight coming down. You can see the drop shadow. So the sunlight's coming from probably this angle over here and shining down on our subject matters. Now, as far as aperture goes, we definitely have a severe blur of the background on this guy. This one a little less because we can kind of make out some foliage there, but we can kind of tell that's probably a car park behind them, and that we've got our grass field and more trees above there too. So I probably would put this one closer to 1.4 to where you really have a good blur of the background to the point where you can't make it out. The only reason I can kind of guess is because I see this shine coming off right there, and I can kind of see what appears to me like the back of car lights, like the red lights.
So when you're saying 1.4, 1.8, you're not talking about the lens. You know, you can buy a certain lens.
Well, those lenses have all those numbers on there. So like if a lens says it's 1.4, you can change that 1.4 and make it 32. And then you can go back down to 1.4.
Unless it's like 1.885. You still can change it.
Like an 85 millimeter lens with a 1.8, yeah, you can change that from 1.8 up to 22. Or up to 32.
But it's just basically saying the lowest you can go.
Exactly.
That's right.
That's what it's saying. So like there's a lot of lenses out there, especially like telephoto lenses, where it'll say that the lowest it can go is 2.8, meaning that no matter how many times you crank it, it's never going to go lower than 2.8. You'll also get lenses too where if it's a kit lens when you're buying the camera, it'll say it's like a 5.6 to a 6.3. That means that when you start at whatever the lowest number is, so like let's say it's an 18 to 55, when you start at 18, it'll be 5.6. By the time you zoom to 55, it'll be a 6.3. You can always go higher than that, but you will never be able to go lower than those numbers.
And because the lower the number, the better the photo is in dark light. That's why it costs more.
Exactly. A lot of the times when you have those lower numbers, it just means it performs better in low light situations. It has a nicer f-stop, so more glass on there. A lot of the times too, when you look at some lenses and they show, it's also because they have different coating levels on the inside that help the clarity and the cutting through, especially when you're trying to blur background out.
And they're heavier.
And they're heavier. More glass on there, a lot heavier. Sony's notorious for that though. They've got their G,
I have one
their
on there
GM.
now, and this is so heavy.
I know.
It's a shoulder breaker.
It's a handbreaker. Just
My camera setup, I forgot how much it weighs. I put it on a scale. It's I think close to 3 pounds.
Oh my God.
But I have a 50 millimeter 1.2 from Sony, and it's like a little mini brick. It's the heaviest lens in my entire collection. 51.2. It's probably like that big of a diameter on there, but I can blur everything out if I wanted to. I love that lens, but it is a barracuda to
So
carry
you use
around.
that for portrait?
A portrait. I use that for mainly everything right now, just because some of these lenses also cost about $3,000, so I'm not trying to spend that much all at once. So.
You don't know anybody here?
Yeah, right. Trust me, if I could pull that favor out, I would be a happy man. But I'll save my favor for a different day. But yeah, when we're talking about those lenses, when we talk about those numbers can always change depending on the lens that you buy. For anybody online, the number they tell you on the lens is the maximum or the lowest number that it can go to. The highest number is usually dictated by the camera or the lens. In most cases, 32 is the highest number, or 22 is the highest number, depending on what type or like the quality of glass that you have. ISO, aperture, and then shutter. We talked about all three of those. So that's what I would say for this image. Because we have movement, we've got something that's in the air. We have to try to slow that down to capture everything. And I think this is one of the last ones before we talk about lenses to finish up the class. This is going to be someone who is jumping into the end zone, so we definitely want speed on this. 1 in 1,000th shutter speed is going to be the way to go. We have nice movement on this guy. We can see the turf as it's kicking up into the air, the rubber parts, but we can see our guy jumping into the end zone, scoring the touchdown. So we're getting a clean image. As far as the background blur on this one, the f-stop, we can see that there are 2 football players behind him. But in my experience, we can clearly make out that that's a number 6. We can clearly make out that this guy's on the floor, missed the tackle, and this guy's kind of either moseying around or also missed the tackle. From that and the clarity of this guy, I probably would say this is a little higher than 5. This is probably going to be closer to like an f8, maybe an f6 at the lowest, but again, given the clarity of the guys in the background, that's where I'm getting that number from. And as far as ISO is concerned, again, sunlight's coming down, we can see a drop shadow right there, we can see a drop shadow right there, and then under are 2 players, so the sun is kind of coming from that angle downwards. We can also see it on the helmet and on the foot. So ISO's probably at 100 or maybe 200. I would say no more than 300 at the most. This is the last one that I have. This one always tricked me up a little bit, and I finally kind of got it and figured it all out. This is a long exposure photo. So in this case, with the long exposure, I'm able to tell that because we have these very bright, obnoxious lights. And as well, everything looks a little bit washed out and a little grainy in certain areas. So I think the ISO is a lot higher than it needed to be for a long exposure. Probably would say, just given the brightness of all those lights, this is probably sitting at like an 800 ISO with long exposure. The reason I'm seeing long exposure is I see these red ray marks going across that direction behind the bicycle, which leads me to believe that a train was going through the station at the same exact time. Given that we can see this whole image in almost perfect clarity, I would say that the bike has nicer areas of clarity on there. It's probably not at like a f22, but maybe a little lower than that, like an f16. Because again, the background is slightly blurred out. There's a good amount of grain on this photo, and I can see how bright the lights are. That's where I'm getting those numbers from. So again, learning your camera is only a start. Anyone can learn to use a camera. You gotta go out and practice these from everything you guys are asking, and anybody online who's watching that's done this before. In order for you to really understand ISO, shutter speed, and f-stop, you gotta practice with it and learn that there's some photos you're gonna take that'll look a little crappy, and some photos that are gonna look really amazing. It's not from a lack of trying, it's more of a lack of understanding of, or I would say more of trying to gain a better understanding of how your camera is deciphering what it's seeing and how you can then use that to your advantage. Best practice that I always tell people about, practice with the camera. If you're going on vacation, if you're traveling at all, I go to London this Sunday. I will have my cameras with me, multiple cameras, so I'm ready to go. So practice and traveling should go right hand in hand. If you are leaving the state, even if it's for work, bring your camera with you. There definitely will be 15-20 minutes where you can blast off a couple photos and really start to play with your camera. And it's always nice in a different environment. Helps you kind of maybe become a little bit more one with the camera because that's all you got while you're traveling. Classes are great too. There's my class. There's tons of other classes that you can take. YouTube is still one of my personal favorites to learn these cameras. If you type in your specific model, you will find 100 different videos all about how to use it, understanding it, hidden buttons you didn't even know existed, all this cool stuff. And then workshops too. If there's a club or anything around you that's offering to have people together to take photos, maybe discuss or critique photos, I definitely would recommend signing up for it. Great way to make friends, but also a great way to just learn more about how others are using their camera and maybe get inspired for how you want to use yours. Recommended accessories, I'll go through this real quick so we get into lenses. Bag, extra battery, memory card, lens cleaning kit, and a strap. I think those 4 are the most important things to have for anybody. You can maybe consider that 5 if you separate them, but have something to transport your camera in. Don't just carry your camera willy-nilly. That's probably my rule number 1. You don't want to damage that guy. Having the extra battery, having an extra memory card. If you go to a place and one of those things aren't working right, it's better to have a backup than have nothing and then be stranded and just have this nice piece of equipment that you can't do anything with. Get a lens cleaning kit. They're great too. My example, I shoot the Chicago Polar Plunge every year. When I got guys that jump into the lake to splash, sometimes they do it on purpose because I'm in full gear. But when they do that, if I don't have a lens cleaning kit, the water freezes almost immediately once it hits my camera. I need to wipe it away to clean that right away. Same thing, if you're out and about, you get a little dirt, a bug flies into your camera, you're traveling in an area that's raining a lot, you want to make sure you have some form of cleaning kit. And a strap is really great too. Don't just kind of carry your camera in your hand. It gets annoying, you'll put it down, someone can steal it. have a strap on there, keep it around your neck. It's the easiest way for you to be always ready to take a photo, so I definitely recommend it too. Tripods are great for extra stabilization. External hard drives are awesome to save your photos, especially if you don't want to use cloud-based solution. A polarized filter, something that cuts down through harsh glare and light. ND filters, a way for you to use a polarizing and a UV at the same time. You really get to address what lighting you want to come through the lens, and then additional lenses, and that's what we'll talk about to end the class. So in the camera world, my favorite expression is date your body, marry your glass. The more money you invest in your lenses, the better it is for the long run. The camera body itself should only last you, I'd say, a good 10 years, 10 to 15 years max, before it starts to clunk out on you. That could be the shutter starts to get slower, that could be the images don't come out as sharp anymore. That also could just be the fact that you're shooting on a camera that is just older, and it doesn't necessarily compare to any of the newer cameras. I'd say for a lot of people still shooting on DSLRs, that's the point they're at right now, where they're noticing that the phone is starting to take amazing photos. How do you get past the phone? Really, your only way is to get a mirrorless, get a new beefier camera that's going to take better photos. So date your body will get replaced as time goes on, but that glass should last you a lifetime if taken care of properly. So focal length and zoom are the same thing, they just acquaint them a little bit differently. Now, someone asked me this a while, how did they arrive at the number of millimeters for these guys? Because the term of millimeters and the lens, they have nothing to do with each other. When you turn your lens slightly, you're not moving it a millimeter, that's just their math on how they did it. I don't quite know the math, it's a very complex way that they decided to go with that, but for the last 200 something years that cameras have been around, the way they refer to lenses is with millimeter sizes. Focal length and zoom are the same thing. When we understand focal length though, it's important to remember that while focal length and zoom are the same thing, there's a couple weird things that are going to happen as we change the number. So 70 millimeter, we've got this really nice shot of birds in the background there, and we've got a swampy marsh, greenery, mountains, and a city somewhere in the background. As we move up to 105, we crop in. We're starting to get rid of a lot of that negative space, that excess area, and we're really only seeing what we get now kind of as a tighter focus. 200 millimeter gets the same way. We're getting a tighter focus in, but now as we look, we can see that the mountains in the background have gotten a lot larger, so have the trees, so have the buildings in the background. Our birds are still getting closer to us though. Now, once we get to the 400 millimeter, the birds are basically in our foreground. The little swampy marsh area is still there too, but now the trees are so big that they are basically the same size as what our mountains were, and our mountains are so big that now we are also able to see more of the base of them, whereas before we were able to see the tops and the sky going behind it. Same thing with the building. The length and the focal length of your lens and the zoom is also going to affect your depth of field on the lens. And I have this little GIF that kind of shows it all off. So when you're looking at this, depending on the millimeter size that you're at, the boy himself is not moving. You're staying in the same position. But as you go to a smaller length of the lens, you're going to notice that his face becomes more narrow. The nose becomes more prominent. It sticks out. We also start to notice how our background really starts to converge into the back. That tree almost disappears behind his head, and we get this almost kind of fishbowl-like appearance, especially as the face is coming out towards us. When we start to go down to a bigger number, and we start to zoom in, the face becomes more plump, it becomes more rounded or oval, fatter face if you will, but then the background itself also comes more forward and becomes more prominent in the image. So that's changing the depth of field as we change the lenses up. Typically, the human eye sees in a 50 millimeter lens. So when you buy a nifty 50 or you buy your first lens, a lot of people will recommend stick with a 50 millimeter lens because that's the starting point for how the human eye reads and recognizes things. From there then, depending on what your needs are as far as depth of field is concerned, as far as angling, that's when other lenses come into play. In this case though, it shows you if you're just doing portrait photography and you're just taking one picture of something, not focused in on the background, this is the kind of thing you can start to expect as you're playing with your lenses.
But if you're taking a group, then you would need
wider would be better. I mean, like for a group photo, it depends on also where you're standing too, because with any of the focal length and anything in that nature, where you are standing in regards to your subject matter. Hey,
Happy birthday.
thank you.
I don't tell you, I'm sorry.
I knew she was going to do that at some point today. So when we look at the background, yes, when you're looking at it, a group photo, I mean, it really is dependent. If you're using a telephoto lens, and I'll talk about those differences in a second, then you can necessarily just change the lens in order to make sure you're getting the focal length for the shot. But if you're using like a 50 millimeter prime or a 35 millimeter prime, you're not necessarily going to distort your background, but you yourself are going to have to move back or forth in order to get everybody in that angle. I usually, if I'm shooting like a group event or I'm doing a lot of people, I like 35 millimeter lenses. Those are my personal favorite because I can go down to my f1.4 since I have that on there, and I can get a really crisp image.
But can you get everyone in it?
Yeah, I just have to back up.
You forget, you're not zooming, you're walking.
You're walking. That's the key with it. That's the hard part. Now you can do something like the 24. You could even go a little more wide with that. Sony, for example, makes a 16 to 35, which is great, and it's a continuous f2 or 2.8 on there. The only thing you might run into is again that more asymmetrical or that more spherical look on there as the background starts to converge back and you're getting more of an up close. But now the other thing to keep in mind too, this is a very exaggerated shot that we're doing here. We're basically up on the person, probably maybe 10 feet away from them, maybe 6 feet away from them. So we're getting a very intense kind of look with this. As you are taking pictures in different environments and you are moving a little bit, it's not necessarily going to be as drastic as this. So common lenses that you're going to see as you go on your lens journey and start buying more, collecting more, figuring out what you need. So your kit lens. We've been talking about it all class, but I use the reference of 18 to 55. That's typically a kit lens that you'll see with a lot of crop sensor cameras. And when we talk about that f-stop number, we see it written on the side there as 3.5 to 5.6. That means that when you start at 18, it should be a 3.5. And as you slowly start to crank it and go up to the 55, it's going to transition into 5.6 as its maximum f-stop, meaning the most blur or the most background to foreground separation you're going to get is between one of these two numbers depending on what focal length you're zooming in. Now, where we can see a flip-flop on that is when we look at something like a nifty 50. So when we look at a 50 millimeter prime, this would be a higher end or a nicer one from Canon because they, number one, have their little gold ring going around it, so it's one of their ultrasonic lenses from many years ago. But its maximum is a 1.4, which means that we can blur the background out pretty well on this one and just focus in on the subject matter or the foreground, if you will. This would be a great portrait lens. This would be a good lens for people who are trying to get maybe a couple's picture, or maybe you're doing product photos and you don't really care about the background. Your main priority is hitting the target or hitting one item on your picture. That's where a 50 millimeter would be great for that, especially something that could drop down to 1.4. The next one up would be their telephoto or zoom lenses. Now the reason these are different from the kit lenses is because typically you're buying one of these with a very specific purpose or with a maybe more marginal kind of purpose that you need. When we look at brands like Canon, the red ring around their lens means it's the L series. It's their top of the line glass. Nikon does that with their Nikkor. They call it out by just basically putting Nikkor on the glass. That's the way that you tell with them. But then on Sony, they do it with a orange G. That's their G Master. That's their top of the line high-end glass. When we look at these glasses, typically they can go down to a minimum f-stop of 2.8 continuous, meaning that with something like this, a 70 to 200, doesn't matter if you start at 70 or 200, you're always going to have 2.8 the entire time. It's a heavier lens, more glass, which means more money. It's a key to remember with all these guys. 24 to 70 is one of my personal favorite lenses. I think it's one of the most versatile lenses. And it's great because you get more of a wide angle into a portrait, which is really awesome for most people. From there, a 70 to 200 might be more for the person who is doing, some live events where they're not necessarily going to be up on whoever they're taking photos of, so they need a little more distance. They don't necessarily need a lot of distance to zoom in to see the birds flying across the national park, but maybe they're seeing their favorite band perform and they're sitting 15, 20 rows back. Can't get up close, you might want to use a lens to zoom in a little bit more to get that photo. But regardless, zoom or telephoto lenses are going to have numbers where they switch between each other, 24 to 70, 70 to 200, and they are, for the most part, either going to have a continuous f-stop if they're one of the higher end glasses, or they'll have variable f-stop if they're a lower end glass. So again, depending on our budget, depending on what we want, that's what you'll see with these. Prime lens versus zoom lens, and I think you said it perfectly. Prime lens, if you want to change the picture that you're taking, you got to physically move yourself and move around the room in order to get that image in the exact framing or way that you want it. Zoom lens or telephoto lens, you get to cheat a little bit. You get to change that number up. Remembering that you have problems with depth of field as far as when you zoom in or zoom out, what foreground-background relationship is going to look like, can always be fixed depending on the quality of glass with your f-stop. You can always change the f-stop to blur the background out a little bit more, to just focus in on the subject matter that you're getting, so that way it doesn't distract with the background. The last lens, and I don't talk about it too much because it's not my favorite lens to really talk about, but it's a great lens for someone who wants to buy a camera. They want a nicer, higher end camera, but they don't necessarily want to travel with a million different lenses. They're like, I just want one and none, that's it. I would then recommend a travel lens. Typically a travel lens is going to be a lot lower quality than your regular lenses are going to be, but in this case you get an 18 to 135 that has an f-stop of 3.5 to 5.6. So it's not necessarily going to be the best for background blur. It's not going to be the best to let a lot of light in. So this would be a great lens for someone who comes in and they're like, I'm going to go on safari next week. I'm going to Africa. We're going to be out and about in the hot sun. What would you recommend? I don't want to buy a new camera. I just want a lens for my camera. I would probably tell them to get something like this. Great for all uses. Great to do a bunch of stuff. Not the best in low light situations, but especially if you're going to be outdoors taking photos, you should have no problem with the speed, with anything else on this lens. What lenses do you need? And I put quotations around need because honestly, I think most people can get away with a 50 millimeter. I think sometimes their friends or people convince them that they need more. But I also feel that when you know you need more, you're going to need another lens. There's really no way around that. My three, or my trinity that I tell people, is a 50 millimeter prime lens, or just a prime lens of some sort. 50 is not what you want. 85 is a great number. 35 is a great number. Again, they both have a little bit of a different viewing angle, but a prime lens with whatever your budget can afford is the lowest number, I think is the best way to go. Get that background to foreground separation, have it really set in place. Portrait photography, someone could just ask you to take a simple headshot, and that could be a couple $100 that you earn for taking a clean headshot. 24 to 70 would be a great option as well too. To me, that's the ultimate travel lens. If I'm going out and doing something, wide angle to portrait, it's perfect if I've got something with my friends, or if I'm just going to view a museum somewhere. Maybe I want to do that so I can get really nice pictures of art or landscape or architecture without having to necessarily back myself up and put myself against the wall to get that shot. And then the last one is that 70 to 200 plus. Again, some people are different. They need a 100 to 400 millimeter lens. They need the 70 to 200. Some people might need the 100 to 400 and then get an adapter for 2 times telephoto zoom and get 800 millimeters out of their lens. Everybody's a little different. Typically, the people I see who need these lenses are more of my event photographers who are going to be back in the distance. I had a wedding shooter come in one time, and he was like, the bride and the groom already told me that I have a pew in the very back of the church. That's all I get. It's a full wedding. So I was like, all right, you probably want a 100 to 400. You want a teleconverter on there so you can see everything that you're taking photos of, especially if you're in a very neighborly church, depending on what you're in. But regardless, this is the trinity of lenses. These are the 3 that are recommended for you to have. It's your short telephoto, your big telephoto, and 1 prime lens. That's definitely the way to go. And that is all I have for you. So it's the longest class that we teach on this one. Next week is going to be the third Thursday of the month, so that'll be advanced cameras. I will be out of town, so Aaron, who's been lovely in chaperoning or viewing the class, he'll be teaching it for you guys. He's more than knowledgeable on this. So, but I guess for now, if anybody online has any questions, feel free to ask. I don't see any viewers right now, so I think we're good there. How can I help you guys? Any questions for you two?
What are your thoughts on Sigma?
I like Sigma. I like Sigma and I like Tamron. Sigma is nice. The way I describe them, they're both very good quality glass without necessarily breaking the bank and buying the Sony or the Nikon or the Canon lenses. You don't have to go and buy their highest end. The Sigma lenses are typically have like a metal body to them, and they have a couple different series. They've got the Art and the Contemporary series.
The art is better, is it?
Art is the better one. Contemporary is more of their affordable one. Art series, it could be the same focal length and everything else. It'll come down to how they coat the glass and how they treat their glass. They're very specific on the lenses.
Which one is this? This one?
Should see either an Art or a C with a little yellow. Silver C. Hey, Art series.
You got it, nice.
So yeah, they're very specific, and it's tough because I honestly don't have like the full reasoning behind it. Their website is awesome because they'll actually give you a little chart that breaks down what each individual. They have all these small little nomenclatures next to it where it'll say like DH, BF, this or that, C, and those, if you look at their little chart, will break down what the coding is on there to make it so specific. So as far as that debate, I think both are great. It really comes down to your budget on that stuff. I don't necessarily buy the third party that often, and that's only because I do like having that G Master lens. I think that the GM lenses communicate so well with the Sony body. It's just a really nice relationship. But as far as the brands go, Tamron's awesome too. Tamron makes extremely affordable lenses. They're usually like 20 times cheaper than what you'll see the main ones are. They just use more of a plastic shell for their lens body. And that's my only deterrent with them. If you're going to use Tamron, just be careful with Tamron. They are more susceptible if they take a fall. They could break a little bit more easily. Worst case scenario with your Sigma or your Sony, if it's not that crazy of a drop, you may get a dent. But usually everything on the inside is pretty firm. Anything else?
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. I appreciate it.
Could I ask one of you two a question?
Sure.
How good are you at putting plastic cover over it? You even do that?
We don't have it, unfortunately, here. Do you have your own?
I have one with me. I was afraid to do it myself, figuring it would be bubble and everything.
We can give it a shot.
You want it?
Yeah.
I brought one with me.
Yeah.
If you had time, I just wanted to.
Thank you.
Anytime, anytime. You're free.
Good luck with your trip and
Thank you.
happy birthday. When's your birthday today?
Today.
Happy birthday.
Oh, thank you guys. I appreciate it. I
Spend it